and their position statement on overall topic, and then we'll try to go over some few specific questions that we prepared in advance. So I'll try to go in order of Geoff, Burke, Geoff, Huston, and Dirk this way. So please, Geoff.
I think you have your
Hi,
own.
I'm gonna share my screen, but go through these intro comments and introduction pretty quickly. If I can, I'm going to skip apologizing for the opening of the paper for another time, but came from some recent experience. I think for me, obviously there are problematic definitions of the metaverse, and I appreciate Alex picking a different term. There are just 4 qualities that I wanted to mention from a maybe more application-oriented perspective that seem to be features of the distributed virtual worlds that we're thinking about as a metaverse or metaverses. One is real-time interaction, which has some performance requirements, of course, spatial organization, whether that's in the virtual world, physical world. I think there's actually a lot of interesting things to talk about there in terms of what the relationship between the real and the virtual might be. Shared experience, so the notion of more than one person seeing the parts of the same thing, which creates the kind of notion of this multiplayer virtual experience. And then finally, I think granular ownership, the idea that elements of the metaverse could be owned, shared, distributed, sold and bought at a fairly granular level. Alex asked us a series of questions that I wanted to kind of highlight quickly and just give some opening thoughts. He asked about non-technical issues. And I wanted to sort of ask just about the last one, which is, what's the impact of a disconnect between the application layer aspirations and the network reality as you kind of review the Web3 rhetoric that's out there around supporting these types of distributed experiences? It's pretty different than the fundamental infrastructure in terms of how trust and connectivity is handled. And in fact, most of the sort of areas of exploration that relate to the metaverse seem to avoid the discussion of the network altogether. So lots of discussions about file formats, about interoperability of devices, about ownership and exchange on the top, but not a lot about what happens underneath and what the implications are for how those services are authored. So I'd love to talk about kind of the role of the network at all. Alex also asked us about our current apps on the right track. And I think avoiding maybe a more fundamental conversation about how we know what's the right track, maybe it'll come up. It does seem like there is an awful lot of discussion about asset interoperability, but not a lot about interaction interoperability and what that means for how services that are providing or supporting interaction between individuals or individuals and other services or AI-driven elements even of a metaverse experience, how those would interoperate, how they would trust each other, and how the data would get exchanged. I think that's not really addressed in a lot of the contemporary discussion and might be a place that ICN could offer some value. Where can ICN be relevant? I think there are a lot of opportunities. I want to highlight just one in the interest of time, which is to come back to a question that I flashed up really briefly, which is what does it mean to network 3D worlds? If I grab a piece of the Wikipedia definition, where is the name data? I'm going to suggest or at least share my mental model, which is to start with the scene graphs that are used to describe different chunks of the world that I think are getting increasingly, maybe there's some increasing ideas about what those might be standardized as. I heard one reference to them as to think about them as the Photoshop layers of the metaverse, right? As things that can be overlapped and intertwined. And the hierarchical nature of those scene graphs that involve sort of semantics maybe of the virtual world, or sorry, description of the virtual world or the physical world, offer us maybe some opportunity to think about direct mapping between name data in an ICN network and the primitives that are used to exchange, store, evaluate trust, and the way that these applications describe both the virtual and the real world, and even sort of these new representations. This is a scene graph from a more recent paper on neural rendering that still uses the scene graph representation as a way of thinking about geometry in the scene. And so this is one of the kind of mental models that I've been thinking about, and I think is behind a lot of the maybe arguments and discussion that I'll have later. Some great things maybe that we can talk about in terms of what's missing in the current network support. I'm just going to flash them up here and then turn it over to the next person rather than talking through them just yet in the interest of time. So Alex, I hope that was a useful intro, and then happy to come back to any of that.
Sure, we definitely come back to some of those aspects. So Geoff, can you?
Thank you. My name is Geoff Huston. I currently work for APNIC, the Internet IP Address Registry for the Asia Pacific. I have a background in ISP engineering. I constructed the internet in Australia when I was working for Telstra, the large telco in the country. You know, dreaming is cheap. Dreaming is easy. Nothing wrong with dreaming. Operational deployment is entirely different. Operational deployment is exceptionally harsh as a filter. And our disasters and failures are far more prevalent than the occasional success. IP mobility. More than 80% of the world's internet connect using mobile solutions. Not one connects with the IETF's mobile IPv4. Not one connects with mobile IPv6. Failure. That's not the only one out there. Let's talk about IPv6 for just 1 second. Only 30% of the world can access a resource using IPv6. 100% can access it over IPv4. 100. So why is IPv6 even an assured outcome in the near term or medium term future? And the real answer is it's not. Now, what's going on here? Why are these things that are, feasible? We can dream about it. We can talk about it. Why have they failed? And the real answer is economics and benefit. Because if you're going to change what we do, then we need to be cheaper because we're going to displace something. Your time, my time is already committed. If you want more of my time, I need to stop doing something. I need to replace that activity with this new event. And the thing that would normally attract attention is it needs to be cheaper. Why did the internet succeed? Was it 10% cheaper than the telephone network? Of course not. Was it 100 times cheaper? Actually, no. It had to be 3 orders of magnitude, 1,000 times cheaper to actually be disruptive, to actually replace the incumbent. And the issue is, what have we built in its place? What attracts consumers? We thought when the web came out, we'd all be content producers. What a joke. It didn't happen. The technology lets you. That's easy. It's easy to dream about that. The reality is we're lazy. We actually have nothing to say to each other. What we do is what television did and what all those streaming channels do. Don't forget, 90% of content is streaming. And so when you look at the metaverse and everyone is a producer, the answer is, I really don't think so. We prefer this to be structured and given to us. And whether it's an online, multiversal experience game or some other curated environment, that's where consumers want. And if you want to talk about decentralizing the internet, then you're taking on, I suppose, conventional reality as we understand it in terms of the economics and structure of this business. And I haven't heard anything that says that's going to succeed. It's not looking all that good. Now, you can dream, and it's certainly feasible to do all this, but the reality is something completely different. The odd thing is we're actually in a name-based environment right now. The current internet is actually name-based, not address-based. Addresses are merely ephemeral tokens. It doesn't matter where you are, you can access my content, but I can assure you that when you access the content that I produced, the IP addresses that you're going to use to get to it and your address are different from the ones I use for both client and server. The name-based system is today's internet. And we use name-based data as the way we do content today. That's where we are. And the issue is, it's actually a two-level point. The names are what we trade in. That's what humans use. The underlying infrastructure works by numbers. That's the way packets route. And that layer of indirection that keeps all this together, the DNS, is kind of an essential part of today's world. Now, unless you can make packets route by names and offer a technology that is 3 orders of magnitude cheaper or more, you're never going to cut it. It just isn't going to work. Because ultimately, what drags consumers by the nose is cheap. Nothing else. Thank you.
Okay, I have so many questions about this, but I'll refrain asking yet and give Dirk floor.
Okay. Yeah. Hi, I'm Dirk Kutscher. I'm currently sitting in Guangzhou in China at
Dirk,
the
apologies. Your volume is a little bit low. I don't know. Any chance you can increase?
Well, I hope that WebEx takes care of it.
That's much better.
Yeah, hi. So I'm currently sitting at the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology in Guangzhou. I had to put on the virtual background because it's getting really bright here at the moment. So I generally agree with Geoff Burke's definition earlier. I think one point to highlight could be that, well, the say conventional definitions of metaverse also include this interaction with the physical world. So it's not just virtual worlds, not just gaming. Well, at least it intends to go beyond that. But in any case, so coming back to your first question, so of course there are many proposals put forward for metaverse at the moment, and so if these things go as I expect, it could be a really, really unpleasant environment. So I mean, clearly the attack surface for any surveillance privacy attacks is much bigger. So you're constantly transmitting audio, video. You have all kinds of ways figuring out what you are doing, what you're thinking. I don't think we have to discuss this in detail. But there are also other risks than just privacy. So that come from the, say, economic or socio-economic power structures of these systems that are built. So if you design metaverse systems as a place where you can hire slaves to dig some virtual assets and control them with smart contracts and so on, you could say, okay, this is just reflecting society, but well, the question is, what kind of metaverse do we want? And so I have formulated like 3 theses in my little presentation here. So one is, I mean, let's be honest, let's not assume that ICN can do anything on this level, right? So, I mean, whatever we do with like really cool technical ideas, even making it cheaper, making it easier to build systems, would not help in the end if the fundamental objective of these systems is to log in users, to extract value from them, to enslave them, and so on. And so I heard Geoff Huston before, but so I mean, sure, it's really naive and super optimistic, but in any case, I think it's fair enough to just ask, I mean, what kind of reality and what kind of virtual reality do we want? And then at least confront the systems that are being built with like these requirements or these thoughts. So what do users want? What technical requirements can be derived from that? And I agree that not everybody wants to like content and be active in the metaverse, but at least you can maybe build systems that do not prohibit this from like day one. One question that, of course, needs to be asked is, okay, is this purely, say, this technical discussion, or would it be even harmful to exclude these economic thoughts? So we've seen what happened to the web, where well, we kind of didn't really think about this until e-commerce really took off and then developed in a certain direction. So that could be a question to ask. So also was the things that Geoff Burke mentioned earlier. So what economic aspects should be maybe considered at an early point in the design? So yeah, technically, so I maybe to kind of connect to what Geoff Burke said earlier. So I think there are really interesting technical challenges, of course, when it comes to distributed computing, sharing data, sharing assets, but also, of course, security. So you might end up with a system that is, although people are consuming, is still a bit different in terms of requirements from today's web and network. So you maybe have more symmetric bandwidth, like users sharing videos and have in-network computing for augmented reality services and so on. You are sharing access to the physical world. So there is also, in this shared application context, we know that this can all be taken care of by gaming servers and so on. But still, you could say maybe these systems would become like more multi-tenant. So you're sharing more infrastructure and more infrastructure at the edge and in the physical world in the end. And in order to get this to work, I think it's quite interesting to think about, so what are the security trust foundations for that? And so who can talk to whom? What content can I really trust? I assume these metaverse systems will have some strong tendency to rename, so real world identities, but still, I think there are some interesting details to discuss there. And so I don't want to go into like the very technical detail at this moment, but so if you were to, provide a better and maybe also cheaper way to build metaverse systems, and you wanted to do with ICN, well, there are some interesting challenges and opportunities. So Geoff Burke earlier alluded to these maybe new ways of composing this virtual world and the digital and like working with the digital assets and like building a bigger vision out of many individual elements. And so in ICN we have like different mechanisms to achieve some of these goals. And I think so my thesis here is that we do not really have to replicate all the existing interaction styles and protocols that we already have. Of course, people would say from operational standpoint, you just use it and it's much cheaper. But let's just assume you're doing, say, creative design here. And in ICN, well, we have different mechanisms. So for like high performance multi-destination transfer, so adaptive streaming to many consumers, I think that would be really important in metaverse systems. So all the sharing opportunities, then you would have some kind of coordination, synchronization requirements. So we are using sync protocols for that. And of course, we haven't really solved all the issues there. So I think there is a huge demand for more scalable solutions. Probably they would be less centralized than we currently think, but that's just my assumption. But then finally, and this was the point of the paper that Dave Oren and I submitted, you would also need something that provides like continuous interaction between, say, a client and a server. So like some common state evolution, so like REST in HTTP today. And so we can talk about later about this when we have time, if we have time. But so this would maybe say another type of interaction that complements the portfolio. And so the point that we made is that there are really interesting opportunities to realize the REST paradigm in an information-centric way, so hopefully much easier, much simpler, and then hopefully also much cheaper than like the current stacks and implementations that use UDP, TLS, Quick HTTP 3, and so on. And so maybe I'll stop here and we can enter the discussion now.
Okay, thank you, Dirk. So at this point, I just want to the cost of so it has to be like many times cheaper in order things to be deployed and things. But I think for this one, if you're trying to re-implement exactly the same thing, like some equivalent functionality of something, then I would completely agree. But I think when we're talking about a multiverse, okay, multiverse is something different. Futureverse of the application, or this metaverse of the applications. So this is something is completely different from traditional communication, and not so the costs here not necessarily have to be cheaper if it's a functionally new thing, like something the qualitatively completely different thing that was not yet imagined, so forth. But the question I want to ask again to everybody is, so if you're trying to dream big about the futureverse of the application, so are we saying for sure that the existing stack's not going to work and we need something else like ICN, or we could do something still in existing stacks? I'm just trying to kind of look from that perspective. Like, so let's say we don't want to do investing on the networking infrastructure. And the question is, what would not be possible? Can we imagine something very good thing, a very new thing that would simply be hindered by the existing developed infrastructure or existing protocols? So I don't know, maybe Geoff, you can, if you understand my question.
I think there's two of them though. Which one?
Geoff Burke.
I think it's a good question. I mean, I think if you imagine these metaverse applications emerging from sort of the current notion of multiplayer gaming and moving assets around that are fairly large, getting the assets, and then rendering an experience and kind of handling the networking between participating elements of that one walled garden, then it seems like you could probably do that now, right, with enough sort of focused engineering effort. But in thinking about the points that Geoff Huston was making earlier, and like, are we really, is the metaverse really the continuation of content creation? And in which case, I think the argument holds pretty well. But I think if you're looking at it as the intersection of content creation that is increasingly user generated, so TikTok watch time moved past YouTube this year, right? So there's a big change in the who's creating content and in what form, and look at that in intersection with where real-time conferencing is going, right? And the possibility of what it means to insert real-time interaction between humans into this environment in any number of forms, plus sort of the IoT and ideas around digital twins of the physical world. If you look at some kind of interoperability across those domains and across the existing people that provide, the existing organizations that provide them, and you have a story about an RTC style conversation in volumetric video sitting within a shared sort of multiplayer world that includes curated content and data from your home IoT environment or business IoT environment that's represented that world. I don't see the path to handling that, because DNS is not really the only way that we get from numbers to names, in the sense that somewhere along the line we have to choose how to trust those names and what the relationships are that we have in terms of security. So there's many other layers, and I think one of the appealing things that ICN has is the idea that each of those three types of currently different categories of applications, content streaming or curated content, real-time communication, and IoT can all potentially share a security framework and set of network primitives that I don't see kind of realistically emerging from these consortia of 1,500 companies working on the metaverse right now. So just a thought on that.
And if I maybe even clarify a little bit the question, so I think within the metaverse applications, we're not talking necessarily about the going to a specific, I mean, having even a server of some kind of doing this aggregation, doing the operations, and like, are we sufficient to exist in like one connectivity to the single connectivity, basically, like all the metaverse application where would require kind of some form of a ubiquitous content discovery, like local content discovery, and not even working with the servers, like some completely distributed fashion operations. So I'm kind of curious what Geoff Huston thinks about like the existing infrastructure. So are we still need to imagine those applications within the existing infrastructure, or we really want to imagine applications and then think of how they need to, like what kind of infrastructure, if any, need to be added like into the existence to support those imaginative models. And so, I'm just trying to bring to the comment that we're not gonna do anything new, or like anything new is doomed until we can do it cheaper.
Well, you know, infrastructure investment is really, really hard. And what we've seen in the last 10 years is a complete revolution in the infrastructure of today's internet. This is not a peer-to-peer network. Over the last 10 years, the only folk who have been building and financing submarine cables, the only folk who have been tipping money into the plant have actually been content distribution networks. The traditional carriage sector, the telcos, have been investing nothing. The internet is actually a last mile access network, full stop. Your packets travel to the nearest data center and intersect with a variety of content distribution points of presence. There is no end to end. There is no peer to peer anymore. That is a marginal business that doesn't attract profit. What attracts profit is actually streaming YouTube, is streaming Netflix, streaming Amazon Prime Video, you know, et cetera, et cetera. And the infrastructure has actually subtly morphed to do precisely that and no more, right? The only focus, as I said, building long distance transit infrastructure is actually to interconnect the content data systems. It's nothing to do with users' packets anymore. That's a loss-making opportunity that no one wants to do. So when you talk about overlaying some pan-CDN metaverse context across a world of disparate, highly aggregating and highly competitive service networks, you're dreaming. You're dreaming because each of them see themselves in a capture mode of users the same way as we saw the bulletin board world in the 1980s. Exclusive capture. Interoperability is not a feature of today's network, not a feature. And so when you dream of these all-embracing environments, these metaverse-style environments, then how exactly you're going to do that becomes a really, really big issue in today's network. Because today's network has gone in an entirely separate direction, entirely. Who's going to pay to recover a peer-to-peer network with huge transit capability? That's not cheap. And all of the money is currently with Alphabet, with Apple, with Amazon, with, you know, Meta. All of the investment money is tied up in a model that is almost antithetical to what you're talking about here. So when you want to talk about the multi-billion or trillion-dollar capital investment, it's not going to come from Santa Claus or the Easter Bunny. You know, you actually need a case where either users are going to pay, good luck, or some third party is going to pay, i.e. advertising. Why would I jump from advertising on Google and Amazon and Facebook, jump from advertising there to jump to advertising in some kind of metaverse? What's the business case? And the issue is, you're dreaming. That these things are remarkably difficult to disrupt. And unless the value package you offer is completely revolutionary by stripping cost, and you drag customers in by making it cheaper, not more expensive, you haven't got a hope. And this is the reality we've learned from a whole series of good ideas that failed. You know, mobile IP anything, even V6, failure. Even the end-to-end peer model, failure. Because if you can't fund it, it doesn't work. So this is why I'd have to say the network over the last 10 years has changed completely. It's not the network we had even in the early 2000s. And building on top of that client server network, that is, 90% of the traffic is local streaming. Trying to build on top of that is remarkably challenging unless you're doing it the way the content data networks wanted you to do it. So you've got to sit inside that model or you haven't got anything to work with. So I am very pessimistic about that. Thanks.
And I think regarding the disruptions, I think Geoff just mentioned the TikTok, so or this like short-term streaming with the user-generated content. So I think they are kind of breaking some of the models, even though they still kind of within the content distribution, but it's going beyond this local streaming of like Netflix movies that were like pre-cached in somewhere, but rather focusing on really something that many users are constantly uploading like, large volumes, and it's being shared locally. And a lot of advertising is actually moving. I think I don't know what's the percentage, I don't have any numbers, but there's quite a bit of chunk of advertisement money moving from the traditional Google platforms to like TikToks or YouTube shorts, Instagram Reels, and so forth. So there is some kind of hope for the breakthroughs on the application level. But again, the question is whether those breakthroughs currently, just because they're reasonably within the existing infrastructure, like it's still aligned with the existing infrastructure, or not, or it's just because it's something completely new, something has been cached up. I don't know.
TikTok is not my video. It comes from a server. It comes from a CDN.
And so, right, I wouldn't use the word breakthrough for seeing advertisements being shifted to TikTok. So, Alex, coming back to your first question, I think I'd like to challenge the question itself, because I think the question is not, say, what is kind of missing at the moment in the technology stacks, because I mean, it's Geoff Huston just alluded to. I mean, there's a whole different economic and technical outcome at the moment. But in this space, of course, you can do many things, right? So you can even do, say, multicast like live video distribution over the CDNs today. And so it's probably quite hard to say argue on this level in terms of what is missing, because if there is a business model and profits to be made, you can be sure that the say big servers and CDN providers will find a way. And I think so. There are two interesting aspects that I'd like to connect, and the first one was again the cost argument that Geoff Huston made. And of course, that's true. Also, consider looking back at the internet development, but was only one factor, right? The other factor why the internet was so successful in the end was also that it enabled a much higher rate of innovation, permissionless innovation in the internet and the web. So you had all these new services in the beginning, and so I think that it could be a more promising, say, way of looking at this whole question. So if you can create platforms that make it, say, way easier for application developers and cheaper to develop new metaverse systems or applications with like certain important properties. So the security aspects, the secure composition of these worlds that we talked about earlier. I personally find that is like the more interesting argument than compared to talking about what is currently missing. Because well, if there's something missing, you know, Amazon or whoever will build it.
I guess just one quick follow-up, Alex, that I think is related to both of the comments is it seems like there's a version of this where it's a different way of applying the existing infrastructure, right? So the argument is not so much you've allocated resources in the wrong way, because those resources are sort of following the content consumption, which I think is my interpretation of Geoff's argument. But it's very hard, even if you are kind of authoring something that is intended to use those resources, to piece them together in a new way. And to piece them to get, you know, so for example, if you have highly curated content that lots of people want everywhere that CDNs are well suited to distribute, fine. But if you want to access that and roll it into a locally personalized experience in a way that I think, you know, for example, is getting at what Dave put in Slack, these are still kind of living in different worlds, and just from an application creator's point of view. And so I don't know that it reverses the direction of investment as much as provides a different opportunity for how that investment is composed into services that people want to pay for. So I think there's a way to live with the pessimism that there isn't going to be a massive shift in physical infrastructure and still have a different type of creation and experience that's happening on top of it.
Okay, so I want to shift a little bit to a topic of security within this metaverse, futureverse of the applications. And kind of the high level question is, do you think, like, even like we start dreaming about that we have maybe new infrastructure deployed in some way that supports this very distributed nature of the applications? What kind of a security we would need in there? And I'm talking about security in a very broad sense, like including the content moderation, because there's a lot of aspects of today's society that something needs to be moderated, privacy issues, and anything else that you would like to discuss, like what would be needed that is missing today? And again, I really, again, using the word missing today, it's kind of harsh stuff, but maybe just what would be needed in that universe regarding the security? What would we want to have in there? Like that would be ICN related, or maybe beyond what the ICN can provide.
Yeah, it depends on how you envision the system, but if you, you know, so Dave Ryan made this comment in the Slack channel that maybe there are some interactions that can just, you know, happen locally and does not really require these backend servers. Of course, we always know how these things play out, but let's just assume this. Well, then you need a trust infrastructure that allows you to set up these secure relationships. And so that would require infrastructure that is not optimized for e-commerce, but for secure, trustable peer-to-peer connectivity. So I mean, we can debate whether that's going to happen, but I think that will clearly be one argument.
You know, we had this world of telephony, where the network was the mediator of security and the devices were untrusted and untrustable. You know, telephones didn't do anything. And then we flipped the model with the internet and actually stripped everything out of the network and made security an end device problem collectively. And, you know, that's been a rip-roaring success, hasn't it? That we now have a network environment that is so toxic it glows in the dark. This stuff is just moronically populated by poor devices with no control and no management. And the quality of this environment is a serious concern to anyone who looks hard. and we're investing billions of dollars in cyber this and cyber that, because when we pushed it out to the end device, we really dropped the model on the floor. And so at an abstract level, trying to think that we can clean up every last one of these 50 billion devices and growing and make security an end device problem still is, to my mind, hopelessly naive. That at some point you need to swing the pendulum back a bit and make security a negotiation between some kind of network function and some kind of device function. Now, I don't know the details of this, and I think there are many potential models, but it's clear that both extremes, all middle or all end, and we've tried them both, have significant problems in trying to make it work at scale. And, you know, the only solution that's left is to push this back a little bit and to push some of the function about who do I trust, who do I talk to, who can I talk to, or who can talk to me, to be a mediation with the network's active involvement. Not complete control, not the telephone model, but not an absolute abrogation of control to my device and nothing in the middle. And so when you talk about this, you know, we've tried both extremes and it's failed. Somehow we need thoughts about how to mediate some balance between the common property of where you communicate, having some elements of security there, together with the devices that are performing it, seems to be the only way to make this scale even further than it is now, and scale in a way that is better than we've managed so far. Thanks.
Geoff, do you have any? Geoff Burke.
No, I think I like the direction of that conversation. I guess the question I would have is sort of, the network isn't monolithic for the reasons that I think were elaborated on earlier. So what does it mean that you put those functions in the network? But I think generally that pendulum moving back is an interesting possibility for this type of these types of applications.
I mean, I actually want to a little bit expand before I go to the questions that I feel on the Slack. So when I asked the question about the security, I didn't mean just the security, like trust in the content or trust in the channels and stuff, but rather because we're talking about the AR application or VR application, where there's a content being generated by the user stuff, whether you can trust that the content in the first place, whether you can, like somebody needs to moderate that content within local environment, like localized environment, higher localized environment. Can somebody ban specific content? Again, because users are not controlled, like, and this is what you already see in all those TikToks and in Reels, people go off the rails. Like, and in reality, you need some kind of a security aspect, but they're just probably not the traditional view of the security where there's no channel to anywhere. I mean, there may be somewhere underneath, but rather there is some concept of the trustworthiness of the content or the truthfulness of the content. I don't even know how to explain this for the panel. So I don't know whether you have any thoughts on like the content moderations in the localized environments. And I see that Geoff really need to go.
I'm sorry. Yeah, we started late. Unfortunately, I have another commitment. So my thanks and thank you.
Really, thank you for joining the panel. I mean, we'll try to continue, but Geoff, thank you for joining and hopefully to see you again.
Yeah.
Alex, I mean, I'm trying to. Oh, go ahead, Dirk. Yeah.
So I think this is going in a good direction. So because I mean, in the ICN community, we have these different ideas of you know, decentralized trust and trust schema and these things, and I think these are really good ideas. But we also have to think critically. I mean, how would this scale up to metaverse applications? And so are these end systems really able to do a correct job of say verifying all these things? And so what happens with revocation and all these questions? And so for me the question is, could there be some, say, acceptable cooperation between these end devices and these network functions that Geoff Huston alluded to, that are not completely, say, not requiring you to completely give up control to like the big servers or the big application platforms. And so I think so from an ICN perspective, I think it's a good exercise for us in a sense that we have to really question ourselves. So is the stuff that we are thinking about fit for that purpose? Does it really work in these highly dynamic and say more large scale trust problems?
Yeah, I think Alex, I was trying to think of a analogy to, you're almost talking about content moderation and this idea of, so there's the level of trust that I think Dirk is getting at, that's related to the components of the actors in the system, and then there's what those actors are producing. And something that's sort of appealing to me in the dreamland, I think maybe that Geoff would describe some of this as, is that if we're in a metaverse application that is essentially able, where there are people that push content into that in a way that probably, maybe a good analogy is a large Zoom call. So and the idea that you can't police what everybody is doing in each box of the Zoom call, but if at some point there is agreement about not only the way that things are, the formats used for the assets or the stream material, but how they're encoded and how trust is kind of captured, you have maybe the ability to more easily have general services that act on behalf of the users to implement their content preferences in a way that spreads across different platforms, right? And which is not, to me, imaginable in our current way of working, right? So you trust Apple's content moderation to do X, you trust maybe another provider's content moderation to do something still, but you have no way to have a consistent way of doing that across those ways of accessing content. I think there's a sort of path of the ICN metaverse that allows a little bit more interoperability in that sense, but that gets again back to some of those things that are the questions that Geoff asked earlier. There's a lot going on.
I think we're kind of talking about the metaverse police, or like some kind of metaverse FBI.
Yeah, and I mean it more as a thing that works on behalf of a user's decisions, but yeah.
But it is like, I think like because in real world we have some kind of a law enforcement. There's some law established, like parental controls, like you don't want kids to see certain content, and the same thing in principle should happen in the metaverse applications, and somebody have to enforce this. I mean, right now this kind of done by the Apple, and you have to trust Apple, or like you have to trust Amazon to do these actions. But again, when we move into the more decentralized world, the Apple is no longer will be like the entity that defines this stuff. There has to be someone else, something else, and there has to be some networking support for these operations. And one question that I want to ask, maybe before going to the Slack, so in the metaverse, Twitchiverse, there will be a lot of content generated. So who owns it? Is it user gonna own, the infrastructure gonna own, the Apple gonna own, everybody owns, nobody owns? Is there such a thing? Or who wants to, or like, I think this relates to the commercialization question that maybe, I mean, but probably it's not better not ask this question, how to make money in metaverse. But the question is, who owns the content? Is kind of interesting to me.
Or how,
yeah,
I mean, yeah, go ahead.
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, I mean, I think maybe the question is how to express fractional ownership, right? And so there are many different ownership models, but how to capture them and express them at the level of an individual asset, I think, is something that would be interesting to spend more time thinking about. This is the kind of thing that there's a hand-wavy blockchain answer that a lot of people have, right? Is track all this information in some type of distributed ledger, et cetera, right? And I don't know that that's a realistic thing, but there is a lot of discussion about how to keep track of ownership, and it seems like a worthwhile research topic in this arena.
Right. Yeah, I agree. I think you have to be more specific when you talk about content ownership. I mean, NFTs are some more way of managing and monetizing some form of asset ownership, but there's also other content, and so I think it's a really broad question, and yeah, I think so. I don't feel qualified to answer that at the moment.
Okay, thank you. And I think there's a tons of questions on Slack. I don't even know exactly which one to ask, but I think there's a question from David Warren. Is there a cost and profit structure for the more localized metaverse applications where global reach is not needed? Like, do the edge wireless ISPs or even physical venue owners have a play in there? So do you have any thoughts on this?
The thing that immediately occurred to me was that there is, and sports is a good example, right? A sort of blend of lots of interest in ownership over trademarked individuals, and when you get to the professional and even college sports, right? But also lots of opportunity for local experiences on a regular basis in large venues that are filling time, are intersecting with advertising. And so I do think there are those types of local experiences, because of their latency requirements, the nature of the potential interaction with the events itself, are kind of nice working examples for local interaction.
Yeah, I mean, I see so metaverse systems potentially like a collaboration server that you would set up in your home or your company and so on. You could do that. Absolutely no reason why if I like wanted to play paintball in my house, so that could easily be done with a local server. The question is, will it play out this way? Like, will the economics of scale, will it not lead to a different setup where everything is just using the next data center hosted service, and because it's just easier, cheaper, probably more secure in the end. So do we have technical arguments so to prevent this like centralization, which seems to be so really the trend right now, right? So for economic reasons, but sadly also for security reasons.
And so you said like the local server stuff, but do we even need the local server? Like, or are we gonna have servers all the time?
Yeah.
But then people have to deploy servers, and this is not an easy task, like from the management perspective. At least I'm talking about my tiny experience owning the server at home. This is like a nightmare to me. And I think there's another economic question from Ken Calvert, like what kind of economic model could power the big shared VR? Oops, and I lost the question. That has to be thousands times cheaper than Facebook. So I guess we're not gonna, I mean, I don't know whether you have thoughts on this.
I'm not sure. I unfortunately have to drop too. I guess just one quick comment is I'm not convinced that it's only the things that are 1,000 times cheaper, right? It's also the things that everybody wants to have, and the iPhone is kind of the classic example of that. And so I do think that qualitative shifts in the type of experience can drive a different kind of uptake in the consumer market. But anyway, I'll respond in Slack.
Dirk, do you have any comment on this?
Yeah, so I mean, this is a complicated discussion, to be honest. There's lots to unpack there because, well, the objective of Facebook is not to provide a, say, optimal social networking experience. It's to make profit of advertising and manipulation. So difficult to compete with that if you want something else.
Okay, so thank you for the panelists. I think Geoff needs to run very soon. So we're probably going to be closing the panel. I really appreciate all the discussions so far. There's a tons of discussions on Slack, so we can actually continue talking there. But again, thanks again the panelists, Geoff, Dirk, and Geoff Huston, who already left. Really appreciate your time and your thoughts on this topic. Thank you.
Thanks, Alex.
Thanks, Alex.
Okay, so and I think there will be something different WebEx for the next session, but I don't know. It will be defined on Slack, announced on Slack.